Blood stained the golden sand like red paint spread over aged paper. Silent Eagle, known among the white men as Alexander Riley, had been following the trail for 3 days. The signs were clear to anyone who knew how to read the language of the desert. Irregular footprints, dark stains on the rocks, a torn piece of thin fabric that did not belong to that land. Someone was dragging an injured person across the Sonoran desert, and every mark in the dirt told a story of desperation. The trail led him to a cave, hidden among rock formations, where the echo of muffled sobs reverberated against the stone walls. In the shadowy interior, he found a young white woman chained to the wall. Her dress, which must have once been elegant, was torn and covered in dust. Auburn hair fell in messy waves over her shaking shoulders. She looked up as his shadow blocked the light from the entrance. His eyes, the deep green of still water, widened with fear, then hope, and finally caution. "Who are you?" Her voice was rough from lack of water, but it still carried notes of a refined politeness that seemed out of place in the wild setting. "Someone who didn't come to harm you," Alexander responded in perfect English, approaching slowly. "My Navajo name is Silent Eagle. Some call me Alexander." "Elizabeth Whitmore." She recoiled instinctively as he approached, her body reacting before her mind. "Daughter of William Whitmore, of the Whitmore Silver Company in Silverdale." Alexander placed his canteen on her chapped lips, letting her drink carefully. "Silverdale is 4 days away. How did you get to this place?" "Bandits. 5 of them." Elizabeth took a deep breath after quenching her thirst. "They demand $10,000 for my ransom. They think my fiancé will pay." Alexander examined the chains that bound her. With a precise swing of his tomahawk, he broke the weakest link. "Will they be back soon?" "2 left to deliver the message. The other 3 will return at nightfall." She rubbed her bruised wrists. "Why are you helping me? Aren't you one of them?" A bitter smile crossed Alexander's tanned face. "I'm not a bandit, or a soldier, or a friend to the men of Silverdale. I'm just someone who still knows injustice when he sees it." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth hesitated. "My fiancé will come with armed men. Robert Chandler controls half the territory. He—" "Chandler?" Alexander froze, the name piercing him like a poisoned arrow. "Is Robert Chandler your fiancé?" "Yes. It has the largest silver mines in the region and—" Elizabeth stopped, noticing the sudden tension in the warrior's body. "Do you know him?" "Not in person." Alexander's voice turned as icy as the desert night breeze. "But I know his work. 3 years ago, Chandler's men found a Navajo village on the land he wanted. Men, women, and children slaughtered like animals." Elizabeth turned pale. "No, that can't be true. He wouldn't—" "I buried my wife and child with these hands." Alexander extended his calloused palms. "And then I watched from afar as the army classified everything as an unfortunate territorial conflict." A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the merciless sun began its descent over the rocky horizon, painting the sky blood-red. "I'm not going to force you to come with me," Alexander finally said, "but your captors will return, and they may not be so patient this time." Elizabeth stood up, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "I'll take my chances with you, Alexander, and as for Chandler, there's more to this story you need to know." As they walked out of the cave, Elizabeth told a story that made Alexander's blood boil. His father, William Whitmore, had discovered evidence that Chandler had not only ordered the massacre of the Navajo village, but also stolen mining land from several rightful owners. "My father confronted him privately. A week later he was found dead in his own mine. A tragic accident," they said. Elizabeth's voice shook with suppressed anger. Chandler appeared at the funeral, comforting the young orphan, and within a month, announced our engagement, an engagement I never accepted. They advanced cautiously across the rugged terrain, keeping to the growing shadows. The desert transformed under the twilight, taking on new colors and dangers. "Why didn't you run away?" Alexander asked, helping her up a rocky slope. "Where to?" Elizabeth laughed humorlessly. "Chandler controls the town, the bank, even the sheriff. This kidnapping. Sometimes I wonder if he orchestrated it, to make me more dependent on him when he rescued me." Alexander stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence. On the horizon, a cloud of dust announced approaching riders. "The kidnappers are coming back," he murmured, pulling Elizabeth behind a rock formation. "We'll head east, away from the main trail. I know a trading post in Valle Sombra where we can get horses." Elizabeth grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Alexander, if you help me, you will be against Chandler. The man knows no mercy." "Justice and mercy rarely go together in this land," he replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I've been looking for revenge for 3 years. Maybe I've found something more valuable, the truth." As the shadows lengthened and the desert turned into the nocturnal realm of predators, Alexander and Elizabeth began their journey, united by shared loss and a common enemy. The Navajo warrior, who had buried his emotions with his family, felt something awaken in his chest, something dangerous and disturbing like the desert itself. The crescent moon illuminated their steps as they left behind the cave and the men who would soon discover Elizabeth's escape. Ahead, only the relentless desert and an uncertain future. "I have no illusions," Elizabeth whispered as they walked. "Surviving Chandler will require more than luck." Alexander nodded silently. What had started as an impromptu rescue had turned into something more complex. The thirst for revenge that had sustained him for years now found new purpose alongside this woman with green eyes and an indomitable spirit. The Sonoran Desert kept its secrets, as did the people who crossed it. As night enveloped the arid landscape, 2 wounded souls advanced together, unaware of the fate that awaited them beyond the horizon of stone and sand. 5 days had passed since the escape from the cave. Elizabeth walked alongside Silent Eagle through the arid valley that separated them from Valle Sombra, a small community nestled among the mountains. The scorching sun beat down on her skin, while the hot wind kicked up swirls of dust around her tired feet. "Is it long?" Elizabeth asked, adjusting the scarf that protected her face from the sand. His once elegant boots were now worn from the relentless journey. "We will arrive before dark," replied Alexander, pointing to a distant mountain range. His black eyes, always attentive, constantly scanned the horizon. "There's a stream nearby. We can rest for a few minutes." The small watercourse meandered between red rocks, creating a green refuge amidst the aridity. Elizabeth knelt, dipping her hands into the cool water. The reflection she saw barely looked like herself, disheveled hair, sun-tanned face, eyes that had seen more horror in the last few days than in her entire privileged life. "You're thinking about your father," Alexander observed, sitting down on a nearby rock. "How did you know?" Elizabeth looked up, surprised by his insight. "Your expression. I see it too when I think of my dead." Alexander took out a piece of dried jerky bread from his bag, offering half of it to her. "Memory is a blessing and a curse." Elizabeth accepted the simple food, savoring it as if it were a feast. "My father was a man of principle. When he discovered Chandler's machinations, he couldn't remain silent, even though he knew the danger." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I thought I was alone against him, until now." A comfortable silence settled between them as they rested. The desert, as hostile as it was, provided a strange peace, far from the lies and conspiracies of civilization. "What will you do when we get to Valle Sombra?" Alexander finally asked. "We need evidence against Chandler. My father kept a diary with records of all suspicious transactions and evidence of the massacre. Elizabeth lowered her voice, as if afraid that the desert itself might betray her. It's hidden in our house in Silverdale. Alexander visibly tensed. Returning to Silverdale would be like voluntarily walking into the wolf's den. I have no choice. Without this evidence, Chandler will remain untouchable. His green eyes shone with determination. And you will never get justice for your family. And you will never be free, he finished, his gaze meeting hers. Something indefinable passed between them in that moment. A mutual understanding, a connection forged by shared suffering and the need for justice. Elizabeth felt a heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with the desert sun. They resumed walking when the shadows began to lengthen. On the horizon, Valle Sombra appeared as a collection of small structures between the canyons, its improvised presence contrasting with the eternity of the rock formations. As they approached, Elizabeth noticed how Alexander moved differently now, more cautious, more tense. Is there something wrong with Valle Sombra? It is no place for a lady, he replied dryly. It's a refuge for those who seek to disappear, smugglers, deserters, wanted men, and some Indians who survived the massacres. The trading post was a rustic building made of wood and adobe, with a faded sign that could barely be read. Rough-looking men eyed the newcomers suspiciously. Elizabeth faced their gazes, keeping her head high. Alexander Riley, a gruff voice called from inside the establishment. An elderly man with long grey braids emerged onto the porch. Scars marked his sun-lined face. I thought you were dead. Not yet, Grey Wolf, replied Alexander with a slight smile. We need your help. The inside of the station smelled of tobacco, leather, and dust. Griswolf, who Elizabeth discovered was an Apache half-breed who had run the place for decades, served them bitter coffee in tin mugs. Chandler has sent men all over the region, the old man reported, lowering his voice. They offered $500 for the woman, and $1,000 for the head of the Indian who kidnapped her. Elizabeth turned pale. My kidnapping. He turned it into my rescue. Cunning manipulator, muttered Alexander. Now he's the hero trying to save his helpless bride. We need horses and supplies, Elizabeth interrupted, determined, and information on how to get into Silverdale without being noticed. Grey Wolf studied her with shrewd eyes. A white woman giving orders in my establishment. Strange times. He turned to Alexander. Your father saved my life once. For him, I will help you. As Grey Wolf searched for maps of the region, Elizabeth noticed how the other customers were observing them, some with curiosity, others with open hostility. Don't trust anyone here, Alexander whispered, following her gaze. Valle Sombra has its own law, and loyalty has a price. As your friend, she pointed at Grey Wolf, he is not my friend. He is an honorable man in a land without honor. Alexander adjusted his knife at his waist. And even then, I wouldn't sleep peacefully tonight. When darkness completely enveloped the valley, Alexander led Elizabeth to a small room at the back of the post. The narrow bed and dusty floor were luxuries compared to nights outside in the desert. Rest, he said, positioning himself by the door. We will leave before dawn. Elizabeth watched his profile silhouetted against the dim light of the oil lamp. This man, who had every reason to hate her for her white skin and her name, risked his life for her. Why are you really helping me, Alexander? He asked softly. It goes beyond revenge against Chandler. He remained silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't respond. Finally, his voice came low and deep. Maybe because by saving her I can redeem what I couldn't save before. Dawn had not yet broken when Alexander woke Elizabeth with a gentle touch on the shoulder. His eyes, always watchful, seemed darker that morning. "We need to leave now," he whispered. "There is suspicious movement in the city." Elizabeth rose quickly, years of refined education dissolving in the face of the need for survival. Grey Wolf waited for them at the back of the trading post with 2 horses, a stout chestnut for Alexander and a dappled mare for Elizabeth. 3 men arrived during the night, reported the old man, adjusting the reins. "They ask questions, they offer money. I don't trust them." "Chandler's men?" Elizabeth asked, adjusting the makeshift dress that Grey Wolf had obtained to replace his rags. "Or bounty hunters," Alexander replied. "At this point it's all the same." Grey Wolf handed Alexander a worn leather bag. 3 days' worth of food, water, ammunition for your rifle, and this. He took out an old revolver, offering it to Elizabeth. "A woman in the desert needs more than pretty words to defend herself." Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before accepting the weapon, feeling the cold weight of the metal in her hands. "Thanks. There's an old trail east of here," continued Grey Wolf, unrolling a makeshift map from a piece of leather. "Used by the Apache before the whites arrived. Few know it. It will take you close to Silverdale without crossing major roads." The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon when they left, skirting the limits of Valle Sombra on the opposite side of the post. Alexander rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. The desert was slowly waking up, soft colors gradually replacing the darkness. "Have you ever used a gun before?" asked Alexander, when they were a safe distance from the city. "My father taught me to shoot when I turned 16, replied Elizabeth. "He said a Western woman should know how to defend herself." "Wise man," commented Alexander, nodding his approval. "We'll need this skill if we're going to enter Silverdale." They rode in silence for hours, the sun rising relentlessly into the sky, turning the air into an oven. The landscape gradually transformed, rock formations giving way to plains dotted with sagebrush and cacti. In the distance, a range of blue mountains marked the horizon. "How long will it take us to reach Silverdale this way?" Elizabeth asked, wiping the sweat from her forehead. 3 days, maybe 4, replied Alexander. "It depends if we can avoid problems." "Like those?" Elizabeth pointed to a cloud of dust rising behind them, miles away. Alexander pulled on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop. His eyes narrowed as he analyzed the distant movement. "Knights, at least 4, moving too fast to be traders. They followed us from Valle Sombra." The fear was palpable in Elizabeth's voice. "Probably someone in town said too much." Alexander adjusted his rifle in its holster. "We need to reach the canyons before they do." They spurred their horses, increasing their pace. The terrain became increasingly rough, making riding difficult. Elizabeth felt every muscle in her body protest, but she remained firmly in the saddle, determination written all over her face. When they reached the entrance to a narrow canyon, Alexander quickly dismounted, pulling Elizabeth with him. "We'll let the horses go alone for a while. We'll hide among the rocks." "Won't they just follow us on foot?" Elizabeth questioned, but she was already complying, following him to a rock formation that offered cover. "Not if they believe we're still mounted," he explained, patting the horses' hindquarters as they trotted off into the canyon. "And not if we leave a little surprise." Alexander worked quickly, setting up a makeshift trap with ropes and loose rocks near the canyon entrance. Elizabeth watched, in awe of his skill. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, as they hid in a raised alcove overlooking the canyon's entrance. "Survival isn't something you learn in a day," he replied, checking his rifle. "It is knowledge accumulated over generations, passed from father to son." The knights were approaching quickly. Elizabeth could now make out their silhouettes against the horizon. Rough-looking men, armed to the teeth. The tension grew with each second, like a taut rope about to break. "Alexander," she whispered, her fingers lightly touching his arm. "If anything happens to me, Promise me you'll take the evidence against Chandler to the federal authorities." He turned to her, surprise in his usually impassive eyes. "Nothing will happen to you as long as I breathe, Elizabeth." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the imminent danger seemed distant. There was something new there, an unspoken promise, a mutual understanding that transcended words. The thunder of approaching hooves broke the moment. The pursuers had reached the canyon's entrance, slowing down to examine the horses' tracks. "There!" shouted one of them, pointing to the fresh marks. "They headed this way!" The first rider entered the gorge, closely followed by the others. When the third crossed the point where Alexander had set his trap, a sharp crack was followed by a small avalanche of rocks, partially blocking the path. The ensuing confusion gave Alexander the chance he needed. 2 accurate shots knocked down 2 of the men. The others quickly dismounted, seeking cover. "Who are you?" shouted Alexander. "What do you want?" "Just the reward, Indian," replied a harsh voice. "Hand over the woman, and maybe we'll let you live." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. Bounty hunters had no loyalty beyond money. They would perhaps be more dangerous than Chandler's own men. "We need to get out of here," he whispered to Alexander. "They'll keep us trapped until reinforcements arrive." He nodded, pointing to a narrow crack in the canyon wall. "That passage should lead to the east side. If we can reach it—" A shot ricocheted off the nearby rock, sending fragments that cut Elizabeth's cheek. She suppressed a scream, feeling hot blood run down her face. "Now!" Alexander ordered, firing twice more to provide cover as they moved. They ran, crouched among the rocks, the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Elizabeth held the revolver tightly, prepared to use it if necessary. The crack was narrower than it seemed, forcing them to squeeze their bodies together to get through. "Almost there," encouraged Alexander, guiding her through the dark passage. On the other side, a new stretch of desert opened up, wilder, more isolated. Without horses, with limited supplies, and pursued by determined men, their situation was desperate. But as they ran, side by side, one thought sustained Elizabeth. For the first time since her father's death, she was not alone in her struggle. Without horses and few supplies, Alexander and Elizabeth traversed the wildest region of the land. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning each step into a test of endurance. After hours of walking, they found a small oasis, some trees twisted around a spring that miraculously sprouted between the rocks. "We will rest here," Alexander decided, helping Elizabeth sit in the shade. The cut on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was red and inflamed. "Let me see this," he murmured, dampening a piece of cloth in the cool water. With surprising delicacy for such calloused hands, he cleaned the wound. Elizabeth shivered slightly at the touch, not from the pain, but from the proximity. Alexander's face was inches from yours, focused on his task. She noticed a small scar above his right eyebrow, the defined features of his cheekbones, the intensity of his dark eyes. "What was your wife like?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Alexander stood still for a moment, surprise evident in his gaze. "He sang like birds at dawn," he finally replied, going back to cleaning the wound. "When she laughed, the whole camp seemed brighter. She was a healer. She knew every medicinal plant in the desert. And your son?" A sad smile appeared on his lips. "I was only 4 years old. I already knew how to ride and follow trails. It was called Taklishim, light of the stars." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth whispered. "I shouldn't have asked." "No." Alexander shook his head. "Talking about them keeps them alive somehow." He finished the improvised dressing and walked away, creating distance between them again. "We need to plan our next move. Without horses, we are vulnerable." He opened the map that Grey Wolf had drawn. "There's a settlement a day's walk from here, Wilson Ranch. The owner, Jacob Wilson, is a fair man who trades with the Navajos. We can get horses there." How will we know who to trust? Elizabeth asked, accepting the jerky Alexander offered. Vale Sombra proved that anyone can betray us for money. We won't trust anyone completely, he replied, studying the horizon. But we need allies. We can't face Chandler alone. They spent the rest of the day resting, gathering strength for the journey ahead. Elizabeth practiced with the revolver, honing her aim under Alexander's patient guidance. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, they sat side by side, contemplating the vastness of the desert. "Why did you stay in the territory after the massacre?" Elizabeth asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had established itself. Alexander was slow to respond. "First, for revenge. I chased Chandler's men, eliminated 3 of them." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Afterwards, I had nowhere to go. This desert, cruel as it is my home." "What now? After we confront Chandler, what will you do?" The warrior stared at the horizon, as if he could see beyond the distant mountains. "I never thought I'd live long enough to answer that question." Night fell quickly, wrapping them in a blanket of bright stars. Alexander lit a small fire, carefully positioned between rocks to minimize his visibility. "You should sleep," he suggested. "We will leave before dawn." Elizabeth watched him from the other side of the flames, his profile silhouetted against the darkness. "What about you? Don't you sleep?" "Later. I'd rather watch first." Elizabeth lay down on the makeshift blanket, but sleep did not come. Their mind raced with thoughts of what they would face. Chandler was powerful, ruthless. If they failed... "Alexander," he called softly, "if we don't get the evidence, if something goes wrong..." "We'll find a way," he replied firmly. "There is always a way, even when we can't see it." "How can you be so sure?" Alexander looked away from the stars to look at her. "Because I already lost everything once, Elizabeth. And yet, I survived. Chandler doesn't know what we're capable of when we have nothing to lose." With the first light of dawn, they resumed their journey. The terrain gradually became less arid, with more vegetation dotting the landscape. After hours of walking, they saw wooden fences and simple buildings in the distance. Wilson Ranch. "Keep an eye out," Alexander muttered as they approached. "If something seems wrong, be ready to run." The ranch was larger than it appeared from a distance. A main wooden house, several corrals, a barn, and a few smaller buildings. Men worked with the cattle, and some noticed the arrival of the strangers, stopping to watch them. A tall man with a graying beard and sun-tanned skin emerged from the main house, a shotgun resting casually on his arm. His eyes, keen under bushy eyebrows, studied the visitors. "Welcome to Wilson Ranch," he said without lowering his gun. "They're far from the main trail. What brings them here?" Alexander stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between Elizabeth and the farmer. "We are looking for Jacob Wilson. Grey Wolf of Shadowdale sent us." The man narrowed his eyes, assessing them for a long moment before lowering the shotgun. "I'm Jacob Wilson. Any friend of Grey Wolf has a seat at my table." He paused, observing the worn state of the travelers. "They seem to have encountered difficulties on the way." "More than you can imagine," Elizabeth replied, stepping forward. "And I fear we will bring more trouble to your door if you allow us to stay." Wilson let out a surprisingly hearty laugh. "Ma'am, trouble is as common around here as dust and cacti. Come, it looks like you have a story to tell." As they walked towards the house, Alexander and Elizabeth exchanged glances. A new chapter of their journey was about to begin, with new allies and new dangers on the horizon. The Navajo warrior felt something unusual welling up inside him, a spark of hope that he had not experienced in a long time. The sun was rising over the horizon as Elizabeth crossed the Wilson Ranch yard, as the first workers began their daily tasks. 3 days had passed since his arrival, Days of recovery and planning that had restored his strength, but not diminished his resolve. On the porch, he found Alexander in silent dialogue with Jacob Wilson. The two men stopped their conversation when she approached. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," greeted Wilson, tilting his hat slightly. "I hope you slept well." "Better than previous weeks," she replied with a smile. His gaze, however, fixed on Alexander, noticing something different about him. "Did something happen?" Alexander exchanged a look with Wilson before responding. "News has come from Silverdale. Chandler has practically mobilized an army to find it. Now he's offering $2,000 for its location." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine, not from fear, but from confirmation of her enemy's desperation. "He fears what we might reveal." "Rightly so," agreed Wilson, pouring coffee into brass mugs. "If the evidence you mentioned really exists, it would destroy everything Chandler has built." The creaking of wheels announced the arrival of a wagon loaded with supplies. A young man with indigenous features jumped nimbly to the ground, waving at Wilson. "Samuel returned from his trip to Copper Springs," the rancher explained. "There should be more news." The boy approached, taking off his hat in respect. "Dad, the city is busy. Posters with their faces," he pointed to Alexander and Elizabeth, "are everywhere." "What do the posters say?" Elizabeth asked, feeling her heart racing. "That you were kidnapped by a Navajo savage who murdered 3 innocent men," replied Samuel, visibly uncomfortable at bringing such news. "They say he holds her captive under threat." Alexander remained impassive, but Elizabeth noticed how his fingers closed tightly around the handle of the cup. "Chandler is smarter than we give him credit for," she murmured. "It turns you into the villain of the story, while casting you as the desperate groom." "Effective strategy," commented Wilson. "Now every white man in the territory will feel justified in shooting first and asking questions later if he crosses paths with you." A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant sounds of cattle and the occasional song of a bird. The plan to return to Silverdale to retrieve Elizabeth's father's diary seemed increasingly dangerous. "There is still a way," Alexander finally said, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's, "but you won't like it. Any path that leads us to the evidence against Chandler is a path I will take," she replied firmly. Alexander indicated the map spread out on the porch table. "There is an old trail that runs north around Silverdale, through Comanche territory. Few whites would dare follow it, but it would allow us to enter the town through the Whitmore property, away from Chandler's watchful eyes." "Comanche territory?" Wilson frowned, worried. "That's suicide, even for you, Alexander." "Not all Comanches are hostile," replied the Navajo warrior. "I have ties to Lone Bear, one of the underboss. If we approach respectfully, we may be able to gain passage." Elizabeth studied the map, tracing the winding path with her finger. "How long would it take?" 5 days, if all goes well," replied Alexander. "But every day increases the risk of being discovered." Wilson stood up, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "I have horses and supplies to offer, but I cannot guarantee their safety beyond the borders of my ranch." "You have done more than we could have hoped for," said Elizabeth, sincere gratitude in her voice. "We know the risks you take just by sheltering us." When the sun reached its zenith, Elizabeth and Alexander were ready to leave. Wilson had provided them with fresh horses, weapons, and enough supplies for the long journey. Samuel, the rancher's adopted son, handed Elizabeth a small locket. "It was my mother's," he explained shyly. "They say it protects travelers." Elizabeth accepted the gift with a lump in her throat, moved by the gesture of the young man she barely knew. "I'll give it back when I get back," he promised. "Be careful when approaching the Comanches," warned Wilson as they mounted. "Approach empty-handed and without visible weapons." Alexander nodded, adjusting his rifle in its saddle holster. "You have been a friend when we needed it most, Jacob Wilson. Navajos do not forget such debts." "Just stay alive," replied the rancher with a tight smile, "and make Chandler pay for his crimes." As they rode away from the ranch, Elizabeth looked at Alexander. In the bright sunlight, his profile seemed carved from the desert rock itself, hard, resilient, unshakable. "Do you really believe the Comanches will let us pass?" she asked, when the ranch was just a distant dot behind them. "I believe they understand justice better than many white men," he replied. "And if they kill us, at least we won't live to see Chandler triumph." The raw honesty of the answer drew a surprising laugh from Elizabeth. "You have a peculiar way of comforting a lady, Alexander." A faint smile touched his lips. "You stopped being just a lady the moment you decided to fight Elizabeth Whitmore. You became a warrior." The scorching sun bathed the two lone riders as they advanced through the wild territory. Ahead, distant mountains marked the border of Comanche lands, another challenge in a journey that seemed composed only of danger and uncertainty. But for the first time since they began this quest for justice, Elizabeth felt something beyond determination and fear. She felt hope. The sun was setting on the horizon when Alexander and Elizabeth reached the border of Comanche lands. In the distance, rock formations jutted against the crimson sky like silent sentinels guarding an ancient kingdom. The wind carried smells of sage and smoke, hints of camps not far away. "We'll camp here tonight," said Alexander, dismounting in one fluid movement. "We will enter the territory in daylight. Approaching Comanches in darkness would be interpreted as hostility." Elizabeth nodded, getting off the horse with legs sore from the long ride. For the past 2 days, they had avoided main trails, opting instead for paths that wound between dry canyons and ravines. So far, they had seen no signs of pursuit, but they both knew that the absence of evidence did not mean safety. "How long have you known this lonely bear?" she asked, as Alexander gathered wood for a small fire. "5 winters. I saved your son during an attack by white bandits," he replied, scraping flints to light the fire. "Among tribes, a life saved creates a bond stronger than blood. And you trust him to honor that bond." Alexander paused, looking at her with an expression Elizabeth couldn't decipher. "I trust he will listen before he decides. For us, that is already a lot." Silence fell between them as they settled around the small fire. The night brought the characteristic cold of the desert, making Elizabeth tighten the blanket around her shoulders. The stars began to dot the sky in a spectacle that never ceased to amaze her. "I never imagined I'd get used to sleeping outside," she commented, accepting the cup of coffee that Alexander offered her. "In Silverdale, I spent my nights in a 4-bedroom house, with servants and comforts. And yet, I felt like a prisoner." "The strongest walls are the ones we cannot see," he replied, sitting down on the other side of the fire. Flames danced across his angular face, highlighting the lines that marked his usually stoic expression. "What will you do when this is all over?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "After Chandler faces justice, do you have any plans?" Alexander stared at the flames for several moments before responding. "For 3 years I lived only for revenge. I didn't think beyond that." His gaze met hers across the fire. "And you? Will you return to your life of privilege in Silverdale?" A sad smile appeared on Elizabeth's lips. "What privileges? The house belongs to Chandler now. My friends think I'm crazy or dead." She traced circles in the dirt with a stick. "Maybe it'll start again somewhere far away. Santa Fe, maybe, or San Francisco. Places where an educated white woman can rebuild a life," Alexander noted, no bitterness in his voice. It was just an observation. "And where a Navajo warrior wouldn't be welcome," she added, staring at him with sudden intensity. The silence that followed seemed full of unspoken words, of possibilities that neither of them dared to name. The crackling fire and the occasional distant howl of a coyote were the only sounds in the vastness around them. "We should sleep," Alexander finally said, standing up. "Tomorrow we will need all our senses alert." The night passed without incident, and with the first rays of sunlight, they were on the move again. The terrain became more rugged as they advanced, with rock formations that seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear into natural labyrinths. Alexander drove confidently, following landmarks invisible to the less trained eye. Just before noon, he stopped abruptly, raising his hand in a warning gesture. Elizabeth stilled her horse, following his gaze to the top of a small plateau to the right. There, barely visible against the rocks, 3 silhouettes watched their approach. "Comanches," muttered Alexander. "Stay calm and follow my movements." With deliberate slowness, he dismounted, leaving his rifle strapped to his saddle. Elizabeth did the same, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched the 3 warriors ride down the slope on their little painted horses. "Keep your hands visible," instructed Alexander in a low voice. "Don't make sudden movements." The Comanche warriors approached in half-moon formation, their faces painted with ochre and their spears decorated with feathers and leather. The leader, a middle-aged man with long black braids flecked with grey, stopped his horse a few meters away from them. Alexander raised his right hand in a gesture of peace, speaking in a language Elizabeth did not understand. His voice was solemn, rhythmic. The older warrior responded in the same language, his dark eyes studying the visitors with piercing intensity. Elizabeth remained still under the scrutiny, feeling vulnerable and exposed. After what seemed like an eternity, the leader nodded and gestured to his companions. "They'll take us to Lone Bear's camp," Alexander translated, turning to Elizabeth. "We should leave our weapons here as a sign of respect. They will bring them later." "Is this safe?" she asked in a whisper. "Safer than refusing," he replied with a slight touch of irony. "Trust me, Elizabeth." She nodded, unbuckling the belt with the revolver and placing it carefully on a rock. Alexander did the same with his weapons, then took the reins of his horse and gestured for her to follow him. "What did you tell them?" Elizabeth asked as they walked side by side, the Comanche warriors forming a silent escort around them. "That we seek peaceful passage through your lands, and that I come to exact a debt of honor from Lone Bear," Alexander replied. His expression became serious. "But I also said that you are under my protection as my wife." Elizabeth almost tripped. "Your wife?" "A white woman alone would have no status among them," he explained, without looking at her. "As my wife, you are protected by the same laws of hospitality that protect me. It was necessary." Elizabeth felt her face burn, grateful for the cool breeze that could hide her blush. "I understand," he said finally, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll play the part of the devoted wife then." For a brief moment, something like a smile passed across Alexander's lips. The midday sun illuminated the path ahead, where the Comanche camp became visible on the horizon. Conical tents spread out in a natural semicircle formed by large rocks. With each step, they drew closer not only to a possible ally, but also to the next challenge on their journey to Silverdale. The Comanche camp pulsed with life as Elizabeth and Alexander were led to the center, where a tent larger than the others stood out. Women interrupted their tasks to observe the strangers, children ran around curiously, and warriors assessed them with suspicious looks. Elizabeth remained close to Alexander, playing her role as a devoted wife with as much dignity as she could muster. In front of the main tent, a tall and imposing man was waiting. War scars marked his bare chest, and an eagle feather adorned his braided hair. His eyes, deep as dark wells, lit up with recognition at the sight of Alexander. "Silent Eagle," he spoke in surprisingly clear English. "Many moons have passed since our last meeting." "Lone Bear." Alexander slightly bowed his head in respect. "I come to collect a debt of honor." The Comanche leader made a sweeping gesture with his hand. Come in, we'll share words and food. The inside of the tent was more spacious than it looked, lit by small fires that barely produced smoke. They sat on woven mats, where a silent woman served them a meal of dried meat and wild fruits. Lone Bear studied Elizabeth with unsettling intensity. The white woman has strong eyes. She shows no fear, although she is among those her people call savages. My people have learned much about who the true savages are, Elizabeth replied, holding the warrior's gaze. A faint smile curved the Comanche's lips. He turned to Alexander, switching to his native language. Elizabeth observed the intense exchange, trying to decipher in the expressions what the words did not reveal to her. Alexander spoke with restrained but emphatic gestures, occasionally pointing in Silverdale's direction. After what seemed like an eternity, Lone Bear nodded gravely and returned to English. Chandler, he pronounced the name like it was something dirty. We know this man. His fences advance over our lands every moon. His hunters kill our buffalo for sport. He massacred Alexander's village, Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite her emotion, and he murdered my father. We seek justice. Justice, repeated Lone Bear, as if savoring a foreign word. White people talk about it a lot, but they rarely practice it. He turned to Alexander. Why should I help them cross our lands? Why not let them kill each other? Alexander remained serene. Because the serpent that is not crushed continues to bite. Chandler will not stand still with my village or her father. His fences will continue to advance until there is nothing left for the Comanches. Silence hung heavy over the tent as Lone Bear contemplated the words. Finally, he rose in one fluid movement. I will grant safe passage through our lands, he declared, and more. I will provide guides who will take you to the limits of Silverdale along paths that white eyes have never seen. Elizabeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Alexander bowed in thanks. But, continued the Comanche chief, his face hardening, if you fail to bring justice to Chandler, Silent Eagle, consider our debt even greater, for betrayed hope costs more than no promise. At nightfall, the Comanches offered them a tent of their own. The party around the central bonfire continued, with drums and chants that seemed to echo through the ages. Elizabeth sat near the entrance to the tent, watching the ritual dances. They celebrate our alliance, Alexander explained, sitting down next to her. Or maybe just the irony of helping a white woman cross her land. I understand your fears, murmured Elizabeth. My own people have been nothing but a plague to them. Alexander watched her with new interest. You speak like someone who sees beyond colors and tribes. Maybe because I was forced to look at the world through different eyes, she replied, turning to face him. The firelight danced across his face, softening the hard lines of his features. Or maybe because, for the first time, I'm actually seeing it. Something indefinable passed between them in that moment. A silent understanding, a connection that transcended words. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken as Alexander hesitantly reached out to brush away a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face. You should rest, he said, his voice softer than usual. Tomorrow we begin the most dangerous part of our journey. Alexander, she grabbed his wrist when he started to walk away. Thank you for everything. We're not at the end yet, he recalled. No, agreed Elizabeth, but I'm not alone anymore, and that's worth more than any victory. The next morning they set out accompanied by 2 Comanche guides. Lonely Bear presented them with fresh horses and a protective amulet for both of them. As they rode along invisible trails between narrow canyons and hidden streams, Elizabeth felt strangely at peace. The lands gradually became more familiar as they approached Silverdale. On the 3rd day with the Comanche guides, they saw in the distance the chimney of the silver smelter that dominated the city's landscape. We're almost there, said Alexander, stopping his horse at the top of a hill. Our guides will drop us off at the next valley." Elizabeth nodded, the reality of her return finally taking shape. Chandler must have men watching all known access points. "That's why we'll use a stranger." Alexander pointed to a narrow ravine that snaked north of the city. "We will reach the edge of the Whitmore property by the old abandoned mine." That night, they camped in a natural cave, protected from watchful eyes. The Comanche guides left after drawing a detailed map in the sand. Alone again, the tension of what was to come hung over them like a storm cloud. "Tomorrow night we'll be in Silverdale," murmured Elizabeth, staring into the flames of the small fire. "It seems like forever since I ran away from that place." "You're a different person now," Alexander observed, meticulously cleaning his rifle. "And he returns by choice, not by obligation." "Chandler won't expect that," she said, a determined smile appearing on her lips. "He underestimated me, all of us." As the stars shone over the desert, two hopelessly intertwined destinies prepared for their final confrontation. The justice they sought was within reach, but the price could be higher than any of them were prepared to pay. Darkness enveloped Silverdale as Elizabeth and Alexander finally reached the edge of the Whitmore estate. The cold desert wind whispered through the parched bushes as the two crept along an abandoned trail that narrowed as they went. The fragile crescent moon offered just enough light to make out the contours of the rocks and the old rusty trails that led to the entrance to the abandoned mine. "My father closed this mine over a decade ago," whispered Elizabeth, crouching behind a pile of rotting wood. "Said it brought bad luck after 3 men died in a landslide." Alexander studied the dark cave entrance, his eyes quickly adjusting to the shadows. "Are the tunnels still stable?" "The main tunnel must be. It connects directly to the cellars of the main house, an emergency exit that few know about." His fingers nervously clenched the locket Samuel had given him. "Chandler probably doesn't even know it exists." They left the horses hidden in a small valley, tied up where they would have enough water and shade. With silent steps they approached the mine entrance, Alexander leading the way, his rifle ready. The smell of damp and minerals greeted them as they entered the darkness. Alexander turned on a small flashlight, revealing a narrow tunnel supported by ancient wooden beams. Cobwebs danced with the movement of the air, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls. "It's further along," Elizabeth directed, her voice little more than a whisper. "We will follow this tunnel for about half a mile until we find a fork. The right path leads to the house." They advanced slowly, each step calculated to avoid noise. The tunnel occasionally narrowed, forcing them to walk in single file. Elizabeth watched Alexander's broad back in front of her, feeling a strange sense of comfort in his solid presence. "Are you well?" he asked, turning briefly. "Yes," she replied, even though her heart was pounding against her chest. "Just thinking about how I've changed since the last time I was here." "We've changed," he corrected softly. "Both." The fork came after what seemed like an eternity. The tunnel on the right was lower, forcing them to bend over slightly. As they advanced, Elizabeth began to recognize markings on the walls, symbols that her father had carved as guides. "We're close," he whispered. "The entrance to the basement is guarded by a false door behind some wine racks." Finally, the tunnel ended in a solid stone wall. Alexander raised the flashlight, revealing a lever hidden among the rocks. Elizabeth pulled it firmly, and with a soft creak, a section of the wall slid aside, revealing a dark space beyond. "The basement of the Whitmore mansion," she announced, a tremor evident in her voice. "My home." Alexander turned off the flashlight. "We need to make sure there's no one down here." They moved silently through the cellar filled with wine barrels and dusty crates. Elizabeth guided them to a narrow staircase that led to the first floor of the mansion. "My father's office is on the second floor," he whispered. "The diary will be there, hidden behind a loose panel in the fireplace." Alexander held his arm gently. "We don't know who's in the house right now. Chandler might have men guarding the place. Or he could be using it as his headquarters," Elizabeth added. "We have to be quick and silent." Carefully they opened the basement door, finding a silent and dark kitchen. The house seemed asleep, although a faint cigar scent hung in the air. Elizabeth recognized the smell, the same kind Chandler always smoked. "He was here recently," he murmured, feeling a chill run down his spine. They crossed the main hallway like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Elizabeth felt every corner of the house calling out to her, memories of a previous life flooding into her mind. The dinners with her father, the afternoons reading in the library, the happy days before Chandler turned everything into a nightmare. The stairs creaked slightly under their feet, causing them to freeze momentarily. When no alarm sounds came, they continued to climb, reaching the second floor. The corridor stretched gloomily before them, with several closed doors. "Third door on the right," Elizabeth indicated. The office door was not locked. Inside, the room remained almost exactly as Elizabeth remembered it. The books lined up on the shelves, the massive oak desk, the leather armchair where her father used to sit. The only difference was Chandler's portrait, now hung where William Whitmore's had once been. "Let's go quickly," urged Alexander, closing the door behind them. Elizabeth immediately went to the ornate fireplace. His fingers found the loose panel with ease, as if his body remembered what his mind was trying to forget. With a smooth movement, he removed it, revealing a small, secret compartment. His heart almost stopped when his hands touched the void. "It's not here," he whispered, panic rising in his voice. "The diary is gone." Alexander joined her, examining the empty hiding place. "Are you sure it was here?" "Absolutely. My father showed me this place weeks before he died, saying that if anything happened to him, I should look here." A noise in the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps slowly approached the office door. Alexander drew his revolver, positioning himself near the entrance. Elizabeth retreated into the shadows, her own revolver now steady in her hands. The handle turned slowly. The door began to open, spilling a swath of light onto the office's polished floor. "Who's there?" A female voice, trembling and aged, broke the silence. Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. "Martha?" The door opened completely, revealing an elderly woman holding a lamp. His eyes widened as he recognized Elizabeth. "Miss Whitmore?" The maid put her free hand to her chest. "Holy Mother of God, you are alive!" Martha hugged Elizabeth tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "We thought she was dead, my dear. Chandler said the wildling had kidnapped her and probably—" "It's all a lie, Martha," Elizabeth interrupted, returning the hug from the woman who had practically been her second mother. "Alexander saved me. Chandler is the real monster." The maid cast an apprehensive glance at Alexander, who remained vigilant near the door. After a moment of hesitation, she motioned for the two to follow her. "Come on, it's not safe here. Chandler has men patrolling the property." Martha led them down a narrow hallway to her quarters at the back of the house. "He comes here almost every day, going through his father's belongings, looking for something." The housekeeper's small room was simple but cozy. Martha locked the door and lit an additional lamp. "The diary," Elizabeth whispered. "Do you know what happened to him?" An enigmatic smile appeared on the elderly woman's face. She knelt with difficulty, removing a loose board from under her bed. From there, he took out a package wrapped in faded fabric. "Your father entrusted this to me before he died. Said it would be the first thing Chandler would look for if anything happened to him." Martha handed the package to Elizabeth, whose hands shook as she unwrapped it. The worn leather journal rested next to a stack of documents and a small bag that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. Elizabeth opened the diary, immediately recognizing her father's firm handwriting. "It's all here," he murmured, flipping through the pages. Records of all illegal transactions, names, dates, even a signed confession from one of Chandler's men about the Navajo village massacre. Alexander approached, his eyes fixed on the pages detailing his family's death. In silence, he touched the names written there, his wife, his son, his friends. Elizabeth covered his hand with hers, sharing a pain that words could not express. "Chandler killed his father when he discovered this evidence," Martha explained. "It was no accident. He followed him into the deactivated mine and caused the collapse." "How do you know that?" Alexander asked, looking up from his diary. "Because I saw it," replied Martha, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I followed your father that day, worried. I saw Chandler and 2 of his men enter after him. I heard the explosion. By the time I got help, it was too late." Elizabeth felt as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Although I had always suspected, hearing the confirmation was devastating. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked, holding the housekeeper's hands. "Who would believe an old maid against the most powerful man in the county?" Martha shook her head. "I waited. I prayed for his return. I knew that one day the truth would come out." Alexander took a map out of his bag, laying it on the small table. "We need to get out of Silverdale as soon as possible. With this evidence, we can look for the federal prosecutor in Wickenburg." "It won't be that simple," warned Martha. "Chandler is in town right now. He arrived yesterday with at least 10 armed men." A tense silence filled the room as they assimilated the information. Elizabeth exchanged a look with Alexander, seeing in him the same determination that was growing within her. "Then we will confront him directly," Elizabeth decided. "Tomorrow is Sunday. He will be at church as always, maintaining his facade as a respectable citizen." "Elizabeth, this is crazy," protested Martha. "He will not hesitate to kill them." "Not in front of the whole city," Elizabeth replied, a plan forming in her mind. "Chandler thrives on fear and silence. It's time to expose him to the light of day." Alexander studied her with a new expression, something between admiration and concern. "A public confrontation can work, but we need an escape route. Even with evidence, we can't trust local justice to act against him." Martha stood up with renewed determination. "I can help. The coachman Samuel was loyal to your father. He may have a carriage ready behind the church." They spent the next few hours planning every detail. Martha brought food and clean clothes, including an elegant black dress for Elizabeth, fitting for a grieving young woman who miraculously returns. In the early morning, when the house slept in silence, Elizabeth found Alexander alone on the small back porch, contemplating the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked, joining him. "I spent 3 years dreaming about this moment," he replied. "Now that it's close, I almost fear it's just another dream." Elizabeth touched his arm, feeling the muscles tense beneath her fingers. "It's real. We're both real." And then Alexander turned to face her. "When justice is served, what happens to us?" The question hovered between them, full of possibilities and uncertainties. Elizabeth realized that she hadn't really considered an after. All her energy was focused on revenge, on justice. But now, looking at the man who had risked everything for her, she saw a future she had never imagined. "I don't know for sure," he answered honestly, "but I know I don't want to face him alone." Under the starry Arizona sky, their hands intertwined, a Navajo warrior and a white heiress, bound by destiny and shared pain. Tomorrow they would face Chandler and perhaps death. But in that silent moment, they found something they both feared they had lost forever: hope. The first rays of sunlight colored the sky with shades of amber as Elizabeth adjusted the black dress that Martha had lent her. Standing in front of the small broken mirror in the housekeeper's room, she barely recognized the woman who stared at her, skin tanned by the sun, eyes hardened by determination, calloused hands that were now checking the small weapon hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Are you ready?" Alexander stood in the doorway, already dressed in clean clothes that made him look more like a bounty hunter than a Navajo warrior. "I was born ready for this day," replied Elizabeth, putting on her black lace hat. "Martha confirmed that Chandler will be at the church at 10 o'clock. As they walked down the back of the mansion, Elizabeth felt the weight of her father's diary against her chest, hidden in her bodice. Those pages were worth more than gold. They were the key to the justice they both sought. Silverdale's little white church stood out against the deep blue of the morning sky. When the carriage, driven by Samuel, the loyal coachman, stopped a block away, the bell was already calling the faithful to Sunday service. "Remember the plan," muttered Alexander, his eyes sweeping the surroundings. "I'll wait at the side entrance. If anything goes wrong—" "It won't." Elizabeth touched his hand briefly. "We will confront Chandler in front of the entire city. Not even he would be foolish enough to show his true nature in the temple of God." As they walked separately to the church, Elizabeth felt every beat of her heart like a war drum. Citizens of Silverdale stood open-mouthed as they recognized her, whispers and exclamations accompanying her steady steps down the main street. "It's Elizabeth Whitmore! I thought you were dead! Look, she's back!" The church was almost full when Elizabeth stopped in front of the open doors. Inside, in the front row, Robert Chandler's imposing profile was unmistakable. Even from a distance, I could see the scarlet stain of the silk scarf he always wore around his neck, a symbol of his supposed sophistication. With a deep sigh, Elizabeth entered. The noise of conversations gradually diminished, until a sepulchral silence took over the room. All eyes turned to her as she walked down the center aisle. Chandler was the last to notice his presence. When he finally turned around, his expression turned from confusion to shock, and finally to a carefully composed mask of joy. "Elizabeth!" he exclaimed, standing up. "My God, it's a miracle!" "It certainly is, Robert," she replied, her clear voice echoing off the church walls, "although not the kind of miracle you expected." He moved forward as if to hug her, but Elizabeth took a step back. Murmurs filled the space again. "My dear," Chandler lowered his voice, although it was still audible to those closest to him, "you must be confused, traumatized after your terrible order. Let's go home, where we can—" "I'm not confused, Robert," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "For the first time in years, I see with absolute clarity." He turned to face the congregation. "I see a man who murdered my father to steal his silver mines, a man who massacred an entire village of Navajos to expand his empire, a man who built his fortune on blood and lies." Chandler laughed nervously, looking around for support. "Clearly, she is distraught by the ordeal she suffered at the hands of that savage who kidnapped her." "You mean the man whose family you massacred?" Elizabeth took the diary from her bodice. "I have here, in my own father's words, records of every crime you committed, including a confession signed by one of your henchmen about how you personally ordered the massacre of the Navajo village." Chandler's composure began to crack. "This is absurd. Reverend, someone needs to help this poor girl." It was at this moment that Alexander entered through the side door, his purposeful footsteps echoing through the tense silence. When he stopped next to Elizabeth, the whispers turned into exclamations of astonishment. "Citizens of Silverdale," Alexander spoke, his voice deep and clear. "My name is Alexander Riley. Some call me the Silent Eagle. I am not the savage killer that Chandler described on his posters. I am a survivor of the massacre he ordered 3 years ago." "This is outrageous," shouted Chandler, his face reddening. "Sheriff, arrest this man!" Sheriff Dawson, a middle-aged man who everyone knew was on Chandler's payroll, hesitated, looking between his boss and the determination evident in Elizabeth and Alexander's eyes. "Maybe we should listen to what they have to say," Reverend Collins suggested, surprising everyone. "Miss Whitmore has always been known for her honesty." Elizabeth opened the diary, showing it to the congregation. "My father kept meticulous records, names, dates, locations. The truth about how Chandler forced small landowners to sell their land, how he doctored ore analyses, how he subverted the law of this town." The tension grew. Chandler, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made a sudden movement towards his holster. In an instant, Alexander had his gun drawn, and, surprisingly, so did Sheriff Dawson. "Don't even think about it, Chandler," the sheriff warned. "Maybe it's time for me to start living up to the oath I swore." "You work for me," spat Chandler. "I work for the law," Dawson replied, something changing in his tired expression. "And I've ignored the law for too long." In the moments that followed, as the diary passed from hand to hand among the influential citizens of Silverdale, Chandler's empire crumbled before his eyes. When he tried to escape through the back of the church, he found 3 more rifles pointed at him, Samuel and 2 cowboys from the Wilson Ranch, who had followed the carriage into town. Under the watchful eye of all of Silverdale, Robert Chandler was arrested. Sheriff Dawson promised to personally escort him to Wickenburg, where the federal prosecutor would take over the case. When they finally left the church, the midday sun bathed the city in golden light. Elizabeth felt the desert air fill her lungs, no longer suffocating, but liberating. "It's over," whispered Alexander at his side. Elizabeth intertwined her fingers with his, ignoring the surprised looks of the citizens. "No," he replied with a smile. "It's just begun." On the horizon, the mountains stood out against the infinite Arizona sky, promising new paths and unexplored possibilities for the unlikely couple who had found, in the scorching sands of the desert, something more valuable than silver or gold, a chance to start over.